Hello, minions! Welcome to Professor Awesome and Minions of Doom. I'm Professor Awesome, and today I do not have one of the Minions of Doom with me. Today, instead, for our discussion of Francis Bacon, I've got another awesome professor, Dr. J, the Diatom Whisperer, the Archduke of Algae, the Fuhrer of Phytoplankton, biologist from St. Cloud State University, Dr. Matthew Julius. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. I'm doing better than and then I'm live and I'm broadcasting. How could it be bad?
It is wonderful in every possible way. So today we're going to talk about Francis Bacon, who certainly sounds like the most delicious of all the English philosophers. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who cares about Francis Bacon? Why did we care about this guy?
So from a scientist perspective, Francis Bacon is really important because he would be the person credited with coming up with the modern definition of science, which is still not largely understood, as we chatted about before. So if you're really doing science, right? If you're trying to distinguish, the joke I always tell is Madame Cleo will collect data. She'll analyze that data, and if your credit card number is sufficient, she'll make a prediction. The dilemma with Madame Cleo's prediction, of course, is she'll never be wrong.
Right.
And the reality is the difference between science and not science is a scientist will tell you what data you could find to be wrong. Bacon was the first guy that said, we should just go ahead and assume we're wrong and try to prove that we're wrong.
And then as long as we can't prove that we're wrong, we kind of provisionally assume we're right.
That's correct.
Right.
Which one of those generally British people are better at doing than the other.
Right. And so this is so we see a lot like in like I'll see a lot on student papers. Students will say things like science has proven blah blah blah, or you'll see a lot in the popular media saying scientists have demonstrated beyond a doubt X, Y, and Z. So what does that mean from a kind of
right? So you don't really prove anything. Maybe demonstrated beyond a doubt is slightly better. I mean, so there's two things to take home from this. This is one, why we all went to prom with our sister. But two, why we're such horrible, awful people in the classroom. So if you think about what scientists do, is we run around and we prove that everybody else is wrong until everybody finally throws up their hands and says, fine, I'm tired of talking to you about this. You can just be right. So you can think about every argument you've ever had. That's how it always ends. So one, it explains why we're such pathetic, petty people. But it also explains why we live such horrible, unfulfilling lives. Science never proves anything. People just finally get frustrated and don't want to talk to us anymore.
So at the end of the day, the best scientist is the one in the room who has the weakest or has the strongest lab.
That's absolutely true. Or the most obnoxious ego. One of the two.
Right. So what are some of the things? So what did Francis Bacon do? Like, how did Francis Bacon become this kind of important figure that he is?
Well, he was reasonably well connected. It was an era, right, where we are much more discipline specific today, right? So probably if it were 400 years ago, Scott, we would have hung out in the same reading rooms, the same bars, the same sorts of things. So people tended to write much more broadly. Bacon probably started his ideas by looking at how most of us start, at what the ancient Greeks had written. And he really just didn't like, particularly Aristotle and Plato, a thing that's called natural philosophy, where we go out and just sort of look at how things are. And because, again, a false premise of natural philosophy is I can know truth, and I kind of already know truth, and I'm trying to define what that truth is. Bacon believed that maybe as humans we relied a little too much on our senses, and maybe we could be tricked by what we see. We could be tricked by what we hear, which probably introduces some interesting parallels to Bacon's personal life about tricking people and seeing things.
Right. Bacon did maybe have a questionable personal life. That's true.
I don't know if he's responsible for the phrase "making bacon," but it wouldn't surprise me.
What are some things for which he may or may not be responsible? There's the question.
Well, I think he wrote all of Shakespeare's plays, didn't he?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, this is a common conspiracy theory that Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays.
That's the most. I mean, lesser known is that the Earl of Sandwich didn't actually first invent the sandwich. Bacon had come up with the BLT slightly before him, is what I understand.
Yeah, many of his lesser known accomplishments, the BLT, right? Well, there are many other things that he invented as well, I think. Wasn't he the first man to sail around the world? I think I remember that.
I think he was. So while Walter Riley gets credit for bringing back tobacco, I think it was actually Bacon or something like that. Yeah. And I think Bacon actually put Prince Albert in the can too, but I'm not certain of that.
But didn't let him out, as the joke runs. Right. And who knows the various other things that Bacon may or may not have done.
Right.
I think he ran for governor and was known as the Baconator. I
believe that he lost to Schwarzenegger, but yeah.
Right.
I mean, actually, we do have to give him credit for, he was constantly running away from things. So the polite way to say that in gentrified society is he was well traveled. But he was well traveled because he was often trying to escape getting killed or something like that. It was always sort of, he might have been the first Captain Kirk in many ways. It's kind of lacing up his boot and flying off and whatever. But he made the best of it, right? I mean, he was traveling around. He would sort of read Aristotle on the carriage ride or something, and write books, which is not a bad way to be fleeing the law.
Well, and the other thing that people don't realize about fleeing the law is it's really good for your buns and thighs. So all that fleeing. I
think he had powerful calves. Is right. my understanding.
And that's an important thing. That's an important thing for any kind of scientist, really, to have.
Right. So why is Francis Bacon important to literature? I mean, other than Shakespeare's plays, of course.
Well, one of the things that's really important about him is essays. He's one of the early great essayists in English. So we got this guy, Michel de Montaigne, who really sort of developed what we consider the modern essay. But the word essay means like test or trial. And so before this, you'd have like treatises where someone wrote a long, detailed, essentially short book about something. And when you start to get, by the 17th century, you start to get people who are more literate and can just sort of read and write a little more casually. The idea of, I'm going to write a short thing, maybe 1,000 words, where I just kind of try out an idea. I test out the idea. It's an essay of the idea. Right. And that sort of has become, I mean, in part, Francis Bacon, not just him, but guys like him, are why the essay is sort of the standard for testing, testing subjective knowledge in students. Why do I always have to write essays? Why not something else? Well, it's because essentially you're supposed to be testing out an idea in short written form for everyone to read. And that's one of the reasons, one of the big reasons he's important in terms of literature.
So that's not terribly different than what he brought to science, right? I mean, he's the guy that introduced experimentation and being wrong. So what's interesting there is that same philosophy about what you know rhetorically, literarily, he was trying to apply to the natural world as well, which we should say is something big that changed him, and I would argue defined the pursuits of other philosophers of sciences. Bacon was looking for the theme that unified all of science, right? Mm-hmm. So how are physicists doing the same job as biologists? How are chemists doing the same job? And I'm sure if we could resurrect Bacon and maybe not make him so worm-ridden, he would say that he was wanting to do that with literature as well too, that what you did as a writer was not terribly different than what you do as a mathematician or an astronomer or.
Right. Well, his four his idols of the mind, you know, the idols of the cave, the
Right.
idols of the marketplace. There's nothing particularly sciencey or as he might call it, natural sciences. You know, there's nothing particular to that about it. It's basically how you think in an organized way.
It's logic, absolutely.
Yeah, and so it applies to. I mean, it applies to almost any field. And the ability to walk into a conversation and say, well, I could be wrong, and that's not just a rhetorical position I'm taking, but a position that's helpful for me to be right. I mean, so for example, I think I'm going to make a no true Scotsman argument, but no true academic. There are lots of untrue academics who have academic posts, but no true academic. All good academics want to be right. We don't just want to be proven to be right. We want to be right.
Right.
And so one of the things that I'll sometimes go into an argument with is I will be vigorously arguing my position, and someone will be vigorously arguing against me. And then suddenly I'll say, no, I think you're right. And then they'll think I'm being patronizing. I say, no, you convinced me. You persuaded me. I'm right. And it's so uncommon, I think, in our culture to do that.
That's the hardest thing for young scientists. I mean, I've got a student that's finishing up her graduate work here, and so she's figuring out the evolutionary relationships of this group. And I think we can mathematically calculate how many answers there are. And it's something like 10 to the 10,880th or something like that. There's trillions and billions and zillions of answers, and we can narrow it down. But she'll never actually know if what her data says is the best answer is actually the right answer. And that's really, you actually get scientists that say, well, then it's not worth pursuing. If I can never know that I'm right, then I don't want to do it, which is curious, because that probably means they're not very good scientists. But it is really a disheartening thing to know you'll never know if you're right. But yeah, Scott, you're a pretty good scientist, right? You defended your position passionately, but somebody got enough data that you knew you were wrong, and you switched over. I mean,
yeah. And
but to reverse back on something, that's also why I think Bacon is important. Is that his idols were vague. It's probably the wrong thing for professors to say to his students, but one of the reasons it was so important is like Aristotle and Plato were very specific about their logic style. Bacon was vague, and it's one of the reasons why, deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning fit in it today as two different styles or two different logic systems for science, and it's because he left it sufficiently wide open, and which is as much of an art as being specific, to know how and where to be vague.
Yeah, and I think something people don't understand too about this idea of walking into a situation, in essence, trying to look for disproofs of your own position, is that when you're shown to be wrong, like whenever I had an incident a few months ago where I went into a situation, I went into a conference and I presented something in the paper, and I was certain I was right. But of course, you go to the conference, you present it live with the idea that someone could prove you wrong. And someone said, this can't be true. And I said, why can't it be true? And he sort of said, it can't be true because of X, Y, and Z. And I said, no, this is absolutely true. What I'm telling you is true. And he said, no, it cannot be true because of this historical fact that you haven't taken into account. And it was a small fact, had to do with literally the when a particular punctuation mark was developed. And so when I got back, I'm like, how can this be right? And I went back and looked at the manuscript. No, I'm right in my description what's going on. I went and looked at what he had said, but he was right too. So he definitely showed that my original hypothesis was false. However, it opened up several other possibilities, two major possibilities, which are way more interesting than the original hypothesis.
Right.
And so what people I think are afraid of is, if I'm shown to be wrong, then aside from hurting my pride, then that just shows that my thought is no good, or I'm dumb, or whatever. No, in fact, it almost always opens up something new and interesting
It's funny because you can go down to like the simplest examples of that. And I preach this all the time, right? And then everybody's done a graph, right? Where you take your data and you plot it out on a graph. And then there's that one little dot that doesn't quite fit on the graph, right? The outlier. And so 90+% of the people in the world are going to say, oh, that's just some outlier. Toss it out. No, man, that's the data point you pay attention to.
Right.
Because that's where something really cool, you explained everything else. I want to know why that dot's way over there. And it may be something as simple as didn't calibrate the machine, but it might be something simple like, oh, we had evaluated the punctuation mark 500 years earlier than we thought.
Right. So like in the case I'm talking about, like there are one of two obvious possibilities. There might be a third one that I haven't thought of. One is this punctuation mark was actually invented a couple hundred years before we thought it was, which seems unlikely. The other one is some crazy person went into this manuscript and for 5 pages just decided to put this punctuation mark randomly in 5 pages of this long manuscript for no apparent reason and didn't put it anywhere else. That's also fascinating and interesting if that's true. And so, you know, I don't have an answer for that yet. But even when I have an answer, it always has to be provisional.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you know, this has actually been one of our more serious conversations that we've had. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to study with Dr. J, you can go to St. Cloud. What's the St. Cloud State website?
It is St. Cloud State. So stcloud, STATE.edu.
All right, you can find him there. You can find me at www.troy.edu, or of course at my own website at profawesome.com. Thanks for joining us today, and go out into the world and be wrong.